Welcome to the SIWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. I thought I'd do a bit of a series of different things, from questions that come from the audience on various topics, from jobs to careers, and even to the various roles and industries that I'm asked pretty often. So I thought I'd do a series on consulting. My background is in management consulting. I was with one of the big four, and a lot of folks ask me about consulting and also on how to get in, because I used to be part of the campus recruiting team. I used to actually lead it nationally for Canada, and a lot of folks ask questions. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a session here to demystify consulting a little bit for those that are getting into it, and then for those that want to actually get into a role, then what can they do in order to prepare themselves. So a little bit on consulting. So what is it? It's really, for me, providing some guidance and advice to a company in order to do better in their business, right? And usually when people talk about consulting, they talk about management consulting, right? So that's kind of the enterprise level for big companies. They're looking to transform their business processes, their new technologies, their people, and growing themselves, right? And consultants, what they typically do is they go into a company and they learn a little bit more about it and see what sort of options they have in terms of improving any different area, right? So it could be a technology transformation where they're putting in a new tool to help streamline the process. They could be changing a business process, or evaluating which market to go into, different geography, different product, a new technology, new policy, new innovation that's coming up. Or it could be to change their people. So there's probably a lot of COVID consulting going on to help with what the whole work from home situation, and also when folks are trying to come back, like what sort of things would they need to do, and then ongoing, how do they reskill, how do they train, how do they make their folks better, who's doing well, who's being challenged from a mental perspective and needs improvement on that respect. Right, so there's all sorts of different areas where consultants can play, and generally speaking, you'll do and operate in any area. So I usually like to break it down simply into kind of like the strategy side and then the operations, right? And obviously it's a spectrum of it, where strategically you might work with the CEO of a company and figure out, okay, what direction do you want to take the company, right? Are you growing? Or do you want to pivot? Are there competitors that are coming in and doing something different, right? And do you have to change yourself, or the technology or the people or whatever it is, in order for you to grow into the future, right? And then once you figure out what that is, then you need to know some requirements, like what exactly do you need? Do you need more resources, capital, tool, money, training, whatever it is, in order to make that happen, right? And then you'll go ahead and implement it, right? So there'll be a technology, there'll be training, there'll be processes and tools that will happen in order for that to happen. And then you'll actually go in and have it run, right? So you want to make sure you test it to make sure that it's working on a regular basis, and it's you're able to continue on, and there aren't any kinks. And if you want to constantly improve, then you go ahead and do that, right? And then you lend it into the operation side of it, right? So in that area, you do all those different things, and a consultant might go through the entire process, but generally speaking, you'll probably specialize in one or the other, right? You'll do kind of the strategy, upfront business case, and financial modeling in order to get that. And a lot of that work will be Excel. A lot of it will be using data tools, doing a lot of research, putting together a lot of PowerPoint decks in order to evaluate options, and probably creating some documents in there as well, in order to say, okay, yeah, we all agree that this is what we want to do. And then as you implement it, then there's usually some sort of technology tool, training platform, or whatever that you'll use in order to make sure that you can roll it out to the entire company, whether it's kind of as a pilot and then expanding out, or as a kind of a big bang where everybody gets it at the same time, right? And then you'll probably use, again, more PowerPoint, more Excel, more different tools, depending on the type of thing that you're planning on doing, right? So the day-to-day for a consultant would be talking to clients, right? Understanding their needs, their wants, their goals, what's right, what's wrong, what they've done before, what worked, what didn't, and understanding what the direction that they need to have, right? So it can be quite interesting in order to be able to understand the different industries that you might be working with, because a consultant might focus on one particular industry where they might just be in financial services or in retail, in supply chain or whatever, or they could go across where they don't focus on any particular industry. Myself, I was in supply chain transformations. I was in the sourcing and procurement group. So we would do that in basically every industry. I would do it at a healthcare provider, at a bank. We would do it for a waste disposal company, for a real estate company, right? But all of them need to buy, and all of them need to hopefully do it better, right? So we would come in and provide some of those suggestions, right? And some people even niche down into both, where they focus on a very specific industry and a function or a competency, right? And they can do that, and they become kind of the foremost experts on it, right? Where there might be only a handful or maybe a large number of people that could do that particular work that's there, right? So some of the players involved in consulting, the typical ones are the big three, which are the McKinsey's, Bain's, and BCG. Then the next tier down are the big four, right? And not to confuse them, it's mainly named the big four because they actually are the accounting firms, right? So the Deloitte's, the EY's, the KPMG's, and the PwC's, those are folks that are also in the game and have generally a good professional services capability and a lot of consulting that they can provide. And then there'll be all sorts of other technology or full service companies like the Accentures and the IBMs of the world, the Cognizants, the CGIs, and stuff like that. And then a bunch of other boutique firms which might specialize in, like I said, a particular industry or domain or function out in the market, right? So typically when folks talk about consulting, they also talk about travel, right? So it used to be that a lot of consultants would be on a plane, they'd be at the client site, whether it's within the city, the country, or the continent, and even across the world, consultants would be traveling in order to meet the needs of the client because they are probably the top person, the most knowledgeable, the most experienced in a particular domain. Now, due to COVID, a lot of the travel restrictions have made everything remote. So it's changing the dynamics of consulting a little bit. So the type of work is pretty much the same, but obviously you're not necessarily on site. So it makes for a slightly different experience there, right? One of the typical discussion points is how much do consultants work, right? And they often work a little bit more than industry. And my experience has been where I had to learn kind of the technology, I had to learn the business, I had to learn the industry, in addition to doing my work, right? There was a discussion with one of my colleagues before that a year in consulting is kind of like 2 years in industry, right? Because it's almost like you're spending one of your job understanding the client, the process, the industry, and all that sort of stuff, all the nuances. And then you do another job to actually do the work, right? To actually consult, provide research and analysis and advice and what have you in order to actually do the true consulting work, right? So it's not that it's actually the same experience, is that you're probably working twice as much, right? So instead of working a 40-hour week, you might work a 60 and 80-hour week just to keep up, right? And now it's not always like that. Usually there are busy seasons, usually when you start a project, when you're about to end the project, and then there's a lower period in the middle. Or if there's some change in scope or something like that, there's a lot of that as well. So that's a high level on consulting, and hopefully that gives you a picture of it, where consulting, it's a great field to get into. You'll learn a lot, well, at least I did when I was there, and every time I did a new project, there was something new to learn, and there is a different dynamics from the client, or something new from the industry, or a nuance that even though they might be in the same industry, the way they do it might be quite a bit different, right? So in consulting, one of the other things that people often take a look at is, well, what's kind of their value? Because a lot of people are scared when consultants come in, because oftentimes that means like layoffs and firing, right? And that might happen once in a while, but oftentimes that's a result of, well, we've streamlined the process where it normally takes 50 people to do it, and now it only takes 30. right? But usually during that process, ideally that remaining 20 could be reskilled to do something else, more strategic initiatives or something like that as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean layoffs or firings of people. So just be aware of that. Don't necessarily be scared of that. Just prepare yourself if you are part of like a consulting initiative where the consultants come in, right? And for the question of how do you get into consulting, well, I was part of the undergrad campus recruiting team, and I led it for technology consulting for a number of years. And generally speaking, the hiring process came in a couple waves. So there's a hiring process in September, right, in the fall, where we would hire a good chunk of our new grads, and that would actually happen the year before your graduation. So if you were graduating in, let's say, 2022, then you would be hired in fall 2021, right? And that's not the only hiring process, but that's generally the case, right? So you want to look 8 months before, 12 months before your graduation in order to see whether you're eligible for that particular cohort, right? And the interview process varies, right? So usually it is a behavioral set of interviews. Sometimes there's a small case component to it. Then there's a fit interview with the partner, and then you're in, right? And that's for the undergrad side, right? The entry-level analyst type roles. It isn't that rigorous, although there are a lot of people that apply. So you definitely want to make sure that you're competitive in the process. And competitive in the process typically means decent grades, right? You don't need to have a 4.0, but you generally need a 3 point something, right? So depending on the number of applicants in a particular year, even the GPA cutoff would change because we wouldn't want to necessarily have to evaluate 1,000 applicants that came through the system. And when we look at applicants, we look for any relevant work experience. So that's definitely well prized. If you can demonstrate that you've worked somewhere before and shown some sort of consulting skills where you've taken a look at something and improved it, made it better, and shown some initiative and things like that, that's definitely something that consulting firms will look for, right? If you don't have work experience, then volunteering, right? Case competitions are generally good, and placing in them is great as well. But oftentimes the case competitions are there for the networking environment, where if you can think about it as like an afternoon long, a day long, a week long interview, right? If there is a consulting company that's there, someone as a judge or just kind of networking, get to know them and hopefully showcase a little bit about what you can do, and hopefully you can make a good impression, and follow up with them after the session and connect, maybe for a coffee chat or a virtual one. Be curious, interested, and look to add value, just like in a typical job hunt, but even more so in consulting because it is a little bit of a more competitive environment. So just being aware of networking or case competitions as a great networking opportunity, as an informal interview, if you want to call it that, right? So if you have extracurriculars in terms of clubs where you are part of the executive team, that's always well received as well. Any sort of part-time jobs, even if it's not relevant, if you can kind of show that, hey, I'm taking kind of a consultative attitude and I'm trying to make things better, and I am different than the normal person that would just work there and show up. I actually improve things in a different way in order to make my business and company more successful. And taking that initiative, having a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit, and taking ownership of stuff, and always wanting to constantly improve is great as well. And if you're self-learner as well, where you have a bunch of things where you're learning to grow, even if it's in like a physical thing, like a sport, but you're constantly improving, that's definitely well looked upon as well, right? So if you think about it, there's a lot of people applying for these types of roles, so you're going to have to compete, right? I almost treat it as a bit of an arms race where you have kind of your degree, right, and your GPA, and that's kind of one thing, and then you stack on things like your work experience, your volunteer, your part-time job, your certificates and nominations, blah, 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 blah. And the more that you have, the more likely that you'll end up at the top of the pile versus someone else who has less. They'll be at the bottom of the pile. And the challenge is, as years go by, people do more and more and more to stay more and more competitive, right? And generally speaking, when you're more on the strategic side, so like the big threes and the big four, you need to be even more competitive than the other side. Those ones tend to focus more on kind of the skills, the technologies, the what you know. These ones are kind of the potential and the ability. Can you connect? Can you do some client work? Can you communicate well? And if you can do that and demonstrate your skills, then that's definitely something that's sought after, right? And doing things like case competitions allow you to practice your case interviews, right? So at some point, you'll likely have a bit of a case interview that's there. If you're more on the technology side, then there's kind of a slightly easier case component there, because that's not necessarily what they're looking for. But if you're on the more strategic side, then yeah, you'll definitely go through a bunch of case interviews. Sometimes you'll do a super day, which is basically a whole day of interviews or discussions or evaluation in some shape or form, right? So just be aware of those, right? And you'll want to practice that from an interview perspective, and don't forget the behavioral ones where it's like, tell me about yourself, where do you see yourself in 5 years, what are your strengths and weaknesses and all that good stuff, and ideally having a couple of examples of how you have improved things, how you have made things better, how you have consulted someone and understood their needs and requirements and helped them implement it as well, right? So all those great things, if you can do a lot of the extracurricular events, make yourself known at a case competition, at a hackathon. A lot of companies are turning to things like hackathons and different conferences in order to find things. A lot of the large consulting companies will actually have a conference. And that'll usually happen in the summer with the application in the spring. And attending that conference almost guarantees you an interview, at least, if not an offer with the firm, because it's kind of a week-long conference or a couple of days. And again, it's an extended interview during that time because they get to see you in there. So that might be also, because the big four will also have different professional services like accounting and things like that, and oftentimes there's a small consulting contingency that also gets invited to those things as well, right? So if you are one of those people without good grades, then obviously you focus on those other things, right? If you have good grades, well, you also still want to have those because you still want to be competitive against the other people who are active in competitions and things like that. Because consulting companies tend to like a well-balanced person, right? So kind of instead of a 9 out of 10 and then like a 5 everywhere else, they want like 8s across the board, right? That sort of thing, right? So it is quite competitive, and if you can do that, then you're more likely to get in. So hiring will be generally in fall. There'll be another session in January, and sometimes throughout the year, but generally from an undergrad and a campus perspective, you have those 2 seasons. And from my experience, a lot of the consulting firms are actually trying to hire sooner. So it used to be in October, then it was September. Now I think they're hiring more in August. So just be aware of some of those timelines that might come about. And yeah, best of luck for you in terms of getting into consulting and connecting with folks. But it'll be a great and rewarding journey, and hopefully you'll be able to take that and make the most of the experience and have fun along the way. So that's a little bit on consulting and a little bit on how to get in, and hopefully you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you again for another guide. Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.